Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is a very ambitious series. What I'm doing is that this is a series on 103 great ideas on virtues. I'm going to focus on virtues. Today we are going to do the chapter on virtues. And I'm calling it the Scribal edition. So firstly, let me give you a background of these 103 great ideas. These are the products of the great books of the Western world. And this is done by Mortimer Adler, University of Chicago, and Encyclopedia Britannica. They put together all thinkers, philosophers, novelists, scientists, historians, economists, all the intellectuals, and asked a really interesting question. What do these people talk about? And they identified these 103 great ideas. And they have this nice little thing called Syntopicon, which I recommend very highly. They have these 103 essays on each of these ideas. I studied these many years ago, and I started my meetups as 103 Great Ideas Meetups. I've done over 50 of these in person in New York. They were extremely popular, okay? This is 103 Great Ideas on Virtues, the Scribal edition. So what is the Scribal edition? Thanks to the Center for the Study of Digital Life and Mark Stallman, I've learned that sensibilities have changed over time. So there is a sensibility, which is the oral sensibility before writing. Then there is a scribal sensibility with advent of writing, especially the alphabet, all the way till printing. And then there is a printing sensibility, which is different. And then there is a television or electric sensibility, which is different. And now we are in the digital sensibility. And I was astonished. I actually started looking at the chapter on virtue as a test for a diagram that I had come up with, capturing the comparison between three great religions that we are studying. We're studying Bible, Tao Te Ching, and the Bhagavad Gita. So I had a diagram which I was using to summarize it. And I said, okay, let me try to test this diagram. So I tested it on this chapter on virtue. And I found something stunning, which I did not expect at all. Number one, that the modern thinkers, that is after the advent of the printing press, didn't have that much to contribute to the dialogue. It was largely the pre-moderns or the scribals that have really formulated these ideas. Moderns, whatever they had was either combination of small contributions to nothing to negative. So I said, okay, let me look at this. Let me try to do just the scribals, and which was very easy to do because the moderns part was relatively small in this chapter. So I was able to get that out very quickly. And then what I did was that I added back the India, China, and the Bible that we had been studying of the conceptions of virtue in the Bible, in Tao Te Ching, and in Bhagavad Gita. So what we are going to do today, the structure is as follows. We're going to start. So what this is, again, coming back to just this slide. This is 103 great ideas on virtue. Today is the topic of virtue. I've removed the moderns. I've added India, China, and the Bible. And I have a diagram that summarizes everything. Okay. But we are going to do it in a very different way. The greatness of 103 great ideas is that it helps you identify the questions that have been asked throughout history about a topic. So we are going to look at 8 key questions that have been asked throughout history on this topic of, let me make sure this is on. Okay. On this great topic of virtue, 8 questions. I'm going to just read out directly from the Syntopicon the core ideas or answers that have been presented. So questions, answers that have been presented throughout history. Then I have just one slide with my diagram. I'm going to map many of these things of the questions as well as the answers into the diagram. And then I'm going to add, I have a table, 4-column table. First, summarizing what the 103 Great Ideas does, then what Bible does, what Tao Te Ching does, and what Bhagavad Gita does. Okay. Then I'm going to, so that will be the presentation. And after the presentation, we will be going through these questions one by one. I'll pose a question and I would like to have your answers about it. So it'll be a really interactive part. As soon as we are done with the presentation, you listen to whatever everybody else has said. Think about these questions. That is how, this is the tradition of actually asking the question from the core of your being. Questions like, what is virtue? How is virtue acquired? And so on. What are the virtues? So you will get to give your own answers in very brief, because I want it to be very interactive. I want many people to be able to speak on each of these 8 questions. So that's the format. So first presentation on 8 slides on the answers that have been presented. Then 1 slide summarizing, putting the diagram and comparing what 103 Great Ideas has with the 3 great books that we are studying in 52 Living Ideas. And then discussion on 8 questions. That's it. So let's get started. The conception of virtue. The essay starts by making a very profound point, stunning point for most people. In their current popular connotations, the word virtue and vice have extremely limited significance. The virtue and vice tends to be connected with chastity or indulgences of pleasure and sensuality. This is how it is seen in modern times, which is a very narrow conception. Now, when I studied the great ideas, this happens again and again. Idea of beauty, idea of happiness. The way in which the Greeks looked at it is very broad. Idea of art, it's very broad. And in the modern times, it is very narrow. Okay. In the tradition of great books, however, the scope of these terms and the range of problems in which they are involved seems to be coextensive with morality itself. In other words, with the broadest considerations of good and evil in human life, with what is right and wrong for man, not only to do, but also to wish or desire, or even to think. So it's a holistic idea. This indicates at once the ancient conception of virtue as the quality which makes a man good, extends to his mind as well as his character, to the sphere of thinking and knowing, as well as desire, emotion, and action. Aristotle makes this explicit by dividing all virtues into moral and intellectual, excellencies of character and of mind. So if anything, if you just walk away with one thing from this presentation, understand the conception of virtue is pretty much dead. It has been narrowed so much today. So if At the same time, we need this conception of virtue. It's a crucial necessity for human beings. And if you just walk away with just that one point, that let me see what the conception of virtue used to be, and let me see if I can understand it, if I can grasp that and see if it has any bearings on my life, then this presentation, this meetup would have made a significant impact on your life. What is virtue? The Athenian Stranger, now all of this is text directly from the Syntopicon, okay? So I invite you to get the Syntopicon. Maybe Joe can put a link to the Great Ideas, things that are available on Amazon, and you can go ahead and get this. It's just gold. In terms of time, amount of value you can get intellectually from any kind of reading, this is just way up there. The Athenian Stranger, this is part of Plato's dialogues, saying that harmony of the soul taken as a whole is virtue, proposes that education should consist in training first the instinct of virtue in children by prescribing suitable habits in them. So the topic of what is virtue and how is virtue acquired are being dealt with together in these some of these paragraphs. But his training does not seem to be like ordinary teaching, that is inculcation of knowledge. It is training in respect to pleasure and pain, whereby we are led to hate what we ought to hate and love what we ought to love. In the Republic, Socrates compares the harmony produced by virtue in the soul with the harmony of the parts of the healthy body. Virtue is the health and beauty and well-being of the soul. This is so beautiful. Aristotle definitely affirms that the whole truth about the matter combines all three factors. There are three things, he writes, which makes men good and virtuous. These are nature, habit, and rational principle. Continuing, acquiring of virtue. The discussion of virtue originates in the dialogue of Plato and the ethics of Aristotle with a number of related questions. Actually, this is part of what is virtue. Both these have gotten combined together. Can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue is acquired by teaching or by practice? And if by neither teaching nor practice, then whether it comes to man by nature or in some other way requires, in opinion of Socrates, the other question to be faced, what virtue is, how virtue is related to knowledge, whether virtue is one or many, and if many, how the several particular virtues are related to one another. So we're talking about three different kinds of things here, three different kinds of questions. And you can raise what I strongly recommend, that always use this amazing device, which is the most powerful technology that all these people in the Scribal age used, okay? Don't go without it. Use pen and paper to keep track of all your questions, all your thoughts, try to arrange them so that when we come to the discussion, you will be able to pull all the thinking that you have done during this presentation in order to have a really deep dialogue, right? So there are three questions. Question number one, what is virtue? Question number two, what is the cause of virtue? Nature, nurture, knowledge, those kind of things. And third one is that, is it one or many? Okay, we're going to look at some of these. Cardinal virtues. In the tradition, in the Greek tradition, and throughout this entire time, the cardinal virtues, there is a tremendous agreement on this. Temperance, justice, courage, and prudence. This is there in Plato, Aristotle, Stoics, all the way till Aquinas, they have this. The virtue has a unity. So now we're talking about one and many. Virtue has a unity the inseparability of moral virtues from one another and from prudence, insisting that they are really distinct as habits. Aquinas nevertheless suggests that these four virtues qualify one another by a kind of overflow. For he explains the qualities of prudence overflow into other virtues insofar as they are directed by prudence, and each of the others overflows into the rest, for the reason that whoever can do what is more difficult can do what is less difficult. So they are distinct, yet they overflow into one another. I love this term that Aquinas uses of overflow. One of the virtues is justice, and it holds a special place. As for justice, Aquinas holds that legal justice, by commanding other virtues, draws them all into the service of the common will. Aristotle also sees certain unification of the virtues, at least all the moral virtues, in terms of justice. The kind of justice he calls general to distinguish it from special virtue of justice. He conceives general justice as comprising of all moral virtues, including special justice, insofar as these virtues are directed towards welfare of society and good of other men. Justice in this sense, he writes, is not a part of virtue, but virtue entire, holding that it is complete virtue, not absolutely, but in relation to our neighbor. He also adds that it is complete because he who possesses it can exercise his virtue not only in himself, but towards his neighbor as well. So this is again a big theme about justice having a special place in those four virtues. Now, one thing that the theologians like Augustine and Aquinas add to the cardinal virtues are the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. The theological virtue of charity, the love of God, is held by theologians to be indispensable to the perfection of all the other virtues in Christian life. Not only, according to Aquinas, do faith and hope lack the character of virtue without charity, but all the other virtues are imperfect in its absence. It is possible by means of human works. He writes, it is possible by means of human works to acquire the moral virtues insofar as they produce good works and are directed towards an end not surpassing the natural ability of man. And when they are acquired thus, they can be used without charity, even as they were in many of the pagans. But insofar as they produce good works in relationship to a supernatural last end, thus they have a character of virtue truly, and moral virtues, and perfectly, and cannot be acquired by human acts, but are infused by God. Such moral virtues cannot be without charity. Only the infused virtues are perfect and deserve to be called virtues absolutely. The other virtues, those namely that are acquired, are virtues in restrictive sense. So this is on theological virtues. What is the good of virtue? Is it an end in itself or a means? If a means, what end does it serve? Moreover, what is the principle of goodness in the virtue? Does it lie in the rule of reason, in conformity to nature, in conformity to the moral law, and the imperative of duty, in submission to God's will? Or are the virtues good only to the extent that they are useful and pleasurable to the individual alone or to society as well? As these questions are differently answered, different conceptions of virtue appear. There is tremendous discussion on virtue and happiness. So what is the relationship between virtue and happiness? Marcus Aurelius gives the simplest and the most familiar answer. Virtue is its own reward. What more dost thou want? The Stoic asks. When thou hast done a man a service, art thou not content that thou hast done something conformable to thy nature? And dost thou seek to be paid for it? The virtues are not only self-rewarding, but they are the only things in which a good man can take delight. When thou wishes to delight thyself, Marcus Aurelius says, think of the virtues of those who live with thee, for nothing delights so much as examples of the virtues. But unlike these external goods, the virtues alone are capable of producing happiness. Virtues alone are not capable of producing happiness, because in Aristotle's views, they are cause of our thinking and acting well with respect to all other goods. We do not acquire. So one thing is that external goods do not produce virtues. Virtues produce external goods. So that's one identification of Aristotle. The second identification, so again, continuing that one, we do not acquire or preserve virtue by the help of external goods, but external goods with the help of virtue. Aristotle finds it necessary. He also says that he finds it necessary to qualify the definition of happiness to the statement that happy man is one who is active in accordance with complete virtue. He adds that he is one who is sufficiently equipped with external goods, not for some chance period, but throughout the complete life. Okay, so this is a quick overview of what people have had to say, but I want to keep coming back to the questions because those are the ones that are the most important. Now I'm going to do something really different. Okay, now many of you, probably of the 27 people, at least 20 of you have seen the diagram before, maybe 15 of you. This is my diagram that I have used, this right over here, to look at the commonalities between the New Testament, Gita, and Tao. And now I'm using the same diagram to talk about the virtues. So I'm going to take all the virtues that are there and try to map them, the ones that we have discussed so far. There are 4 cardinal virtues: justice, temperance, courage, and prudence. And in addition to that, we've talked about the theological virtues. Okay. So firstly, let me explain the diagram. Okay. The yellow here is the spiritual. The blue is the intellectual. The green is the physical, material, and the red is the emotional. This entire left part is you. You see the white dot here, that's you. So put yourself in that position. Okay, that's where you are, and you have these 4 aspects. There is community here on the other side. Okay, and this entire area, the right side, is the community. So this is you, and this is the community. Okay, so let's look at the virtues that we've been discussing. Temperance is managing your emotions to make sure that it is consistent with everything else. So that's temperance. Courage is your courage to take action of what you need to do. Prudence, so temperance is a red virtue, it's right over here. The courage is a green virtue of taking the action, courage to take the action while managing your emotions, but it is mostly about taking action that you need to take. Prudence is about thinking about things that are practical, that manage everything, but it's primarily an intellectual virtue. So those are the 3 virtues that we talked about. Now, the things that the theologians added was the theological virtues, and Aquinas summarizes them as love of God. So this is love of your spirit. That was something that was missing. So we've got love of God, the yellow, we've got prudence, we've got courage, and we've got temperance. So now you ask, where is justice? Justice is basically having the right relationship between you and the community. And it is basically your relationship with the community or your relationship with other people, and making sure that that relationship is just, it is proper, it is fair, it's all about that. It is relationship between how these relate to this. So in that sense, what Aquinas is saying, what Aristotle was saying is profoundly true, that justice, in order to implement justice, you have to implement all of these things within yourself and in relationship to other people. So that's my quick summary of mapping the virtues that we have discussed in the Syntopicon, in the 103 Great Ideas. Now, I was astonished that their treatment of virtue in Bible was not very good. I would have expected them to do a spectacular job. So we just did a 5-hour meetup on Gospel of John. What is virtue in the New Testament? It is Jesus. Jesus is the way. Now, I want to show you how powerful this is, because you see that they were discussing the top of, is this, they were talking about, is this one or many? By the way, this is my name for my diagram. It's called E quinque unum. E quinque unum. That means from the 5, 1. Okay. And you can see that actually this one is the best example in the West that I've seen of the integration of all 5. So look at Jesus as a person. He is God. He has this, the yellow. He's the Word. He has the blue, full intellectual virtue. He's the flesh. He is in the flesh. He has love. And his commandment is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. That is justice plus. And all of that is there in his person as a single person. So it is one in a person. The godliness, the spiritual value, the intellectual value of the word, the reality, and doing the work, and the love, and the relationship. What this is church. When there is this love between people, it creates a community which in this context is church. So it is God, word, flesh, love, church. Let's look at Gita. In Gita, Krishna is specifying 4 different kinds of yogas. There is the karma yoga of doing the right action. There is a jnana yoga, which is the intellectual, the blue, of understanding everything. There is the bhakti yoga, which is based on devotion. And there is a raja yoga, which is about training your attention on the deepest part of your soul or your spirit. And the core idea of India, when you say namaste, you're saying the divine spark in me greets the divine spark in you. So it's all about seeing. The community is based on seeing the divinity in others, which is a very profound way of putting everything together. So that is Gita in this diagram. And this is how it maps into similarity with the traditional virtues, the example in New Testament of Jesus. Tao is a little bit more complicated. Tao is the spirit of the universe, of nature. It's how nature operates. That is the most spiritual thing. Instead of going this way, Tao Te Ching goes the other way. It says the way you do that is by feeling, is by being open to the Tao with your heart and finding the way that is consistent with the Tao. So Tao, and this is the. And what happens with action? When you're doing that, you have something called Wu Wei. That means you're acting in line with how the nature is. So the action is effortless, or action is no action. It is very skeptical about names. It is saying that most names make these 10,000 things which are not really in accordance with the Tao. So it's a but it has different ways. And the way in which they handle social relations is that a sage doesn't force people, but inspires them through example. That's how they are looking at this. So this is a very quick view. I have to tell you that I'm not a scholar in New Testament or Gita or Tao. So this is just an attempt to bring things together that we are studying in 52 Living Ideas. All right. So let me come back to questions now. Okay. So what we're going to do is we are now going to go one by one through all these questions, and we will go ahead and discuss these questions one by one. Let's see how we're doing on time. So it's about 30 minutes into the presentation. That's not bad. All right. So folks, it's time for questions. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to answer the question. So we're going to go with the question. So you're going to do it in two stages. First, we are just going to deal with questions one by one. I'll pose a question, one of the, those 8 questions one by one. Any comments that you have on it, you can go ahead and make. Try to keep your comments very brief, maybe 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, something like that. And we will go to the next one. After we have gone through all 8 questions, then I'm going to open it up for any questions. We'll collect all the questions, organize them, and then we're going to have a lightning round of questions. All right, so go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to answer the first question. So let me bring up the first question. Let me go back to the difference between the modern conception of virtue as being very narrow as compared to the ancient conception of virtue. If you have a comment on that, go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Go right ahead. Let's start with Joe, followed by DLJ, followed by Ada. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, the virtue, the ancients' virtue, approach to virtue was a way of knowing and actually a way of being and living in accordance with nature and each other. And it was also our ability to think rationally. So it is our ability to act in the world. So that's how the ancients viewed it. The moderns viewed it a little bit simply, a little bit differently. along moral aspects of things, of right or wrong. And they have a very narrow kind of approach to saying, if you're doing X or Y, then that's necessarily not in accordance with what this rule. Like it could be a religious doctrine or whatever it may be. It may be in violation of something, but it's a very narrow definition as opposed to how to live in the world and understand the world itself.
Wonderful, thank you. I just wanted to point out one thing that I did not emphasize. They asked the question, what is virtue? So partly virtue is knowledge. It's knowledge of what path you need to follow, but it's not just that. It is that which is habituated. So you're actually acting according to that which is pointing to the highest goal that you have, the highest aspirations, and one that you are motivated to do. So it's all kind of, all of these things acting together is what they're seeing as virtue. Thank you. Next up is going to be DLJ. Sorry, Joe, you had something?
No, I mean, I think that's kind of critical, is the idea that it is a habit.
Yeah.
Virtue is absolutely a habit in the ancient world, and it's repeatable. That's because it's something that can be repeated and determined that is good for the overall, for your overall benefit.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be DLJ, followed by Ada. DLJ.
So yeah, the short answer to that question that was on the PowerPoint is yes. Could stop there really, but the question then arises, do you want to re-educate people to the old way of talking about virtue and vice, or do you want to come up with newer terminology that would fit your wider audience?
Excellent, excellent question. So we will put that, what to do, okay, as a question when we start discussing questions. Thank you, a great point. Next up is Ada, David, Adelson, Cheryl, Mike, and Jyoti. Ada.
Yes, yeah, I just have a question I would like to add to the list.
Sure.
And my question is, whom, if anyone, is exempt from having, virtue, or exempt from living in accordance to virtue? Whom, if anyone?
Very good. Who is exempt? What do you do about modern times? Okay, so folks, feel free to put questions down. Okay, I'll collect all the questions and I'm going to organize all of them, and we're going to discuss all the questions together. So at this point, you can either comment on this question about the difference between the modern conception and ancient conception, or you can put a question down. Next up is going to be David. David, go ahead.
Yes, Shrikant. I don't think it's necessarily, or maybe we're being making an assumption that not everybody in the past was Socrates or Aristotle or Marcus Aurelius. So, the reality of virtue in the past, maybe we're looking at it through this very limited vision. I mean, unless you go to, Herculaneum or something of, the scrawlings on the walls there, of what people really thought in a broader sense of what virtue is. But in the specific sense, I definitely think that there's a concern, as maybe the previous speakers mentioning, whether we're combining or turning virtue into a vice. I mean, especially with all the virtue signaling we're doing now of what our definition of virtue is maybe being distorted.
Thank you. Next up is Cheryl, Mike, Jyoti, Kevin, and Brian. So Cheryl.
I just wanted to mention that I've been part of Ben Franklin circles for a while. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. I guess he would be considered kind of modern, but he's known for his 13 virtues that would counteract unwanted behavior. And they're temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. And then many times people have kind of like gone beyond that list, but this was his initial, and he used to hold regular meetings to talk about these virtues. That's kind of what
excellent point, Cheryl. And he also habituated, he had this entire plan, of focusing on one virtue for a period of time and going to the next virtue.
Yeah.
So it also points to the fact of, that habit is crucial to this.
Yeah.
Mike, what's your comment? Brief, please.
Briefly, going back to Shakespeare, nothing is good or bad, save thinking make it so. I think we need to take a step back in defining virtue as to going back to the origin story and what we are, why we were created, who created us, why we were created, what is the purpose of life, and then you can decide in that concept of why what virtue is, and in both a modern sense, an ancient sense, and the common sense of these 5 religions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Jyoti and Kevin. Jyoti.
What is the role of nature in the formation of all these virtues?
Wonderful. What is the role of nature? Excellent. Next up is Kevin, followed by Brian. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. Sri still got energy, a long day. Eh? Yeah, my point of view about this question, our community over individual, you see, use the kind of one line, the decline, basically. All the days, they focus more community over individual. Now we got more emphasize individual rights, and that's the second one is about virtue over law or ethic. Virtue is something you do it, you should do. It's a habit. Ethic is something you don't need it, you don't do it. Here's the law. So that's something. And also you look at your diagram is top down. If you look very interested, you look from a cross line, they also make sense too. I would expect the contemporary virtue getting more hybrid, multiple aspect, and get more optimal, more view from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is going to be Brian, followed by Margarita. Brian.
So I'd like to try to answer the difference between modern and ancient concepts of virtue. If we just focus on virtue, I think you could see it as from an Aristotelian perspective as a formal cause. It is the character of the actor, and some of the more modern views don't focus so much on the character, which could be embodied in the word habit or whatever, education, training. It's for the individual, it's focused more on things like duty or consequence, utilitarianism. It gives you a formula. It's a bit more, if you will, intellectual of a pursuit.
Wonderful. Excellent observation. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Margarita.
Yes, with regard the same question as Brian just mentioned, I think the modern views are just also a continuation from the previous perspective. However, I think there's a bit of twist using psychometric. In my field, positive psychology, these traits are not just abstraction for philosophical questions, but also how you measure from one person and you extract what are the important virtue in that. So in a way, it's different way of approaching virtue. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Margarita. Next question is going to be, what is virtue? What do you think is virtue? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to answer that. Again, while you're doing that, you're welcome to ask whatever questions that occur to you. I'll keep collecting all the questions. If you'd like to, let's put both them. Let's start with what is virtue, and then if you want, you can also do the second question, which is how is virtue acquired? How do you end up having virtue? Okay, so next up is going to be Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Virtue is how you maintain your own personal character. And I think the cardinal virtues are, again, they're basically principles by which you can then manage your life by, so that you make these decisions. If you're making something and a decision's in accordance with justice, then you're able to do other things that are also virtuous as a side thing. So one example, the one I always use, is that you can be charitable if you're just, but if you're an unjust person, you can't be charitable. It doesn't work that way. So the idea that also you could, as well as acting wisely or acting courageously, these two are intertwined with one another. So if I can't, if I don't know the danger that I'm actually facing, then how do I act courageously? You just can't, because you're just acting. So you need to have wise, you have to have knowledge. So these are things that are actually ways of managing our lives and our own personal character and how we interact with each other and society as a whole. So it's our ability to think rationally, in addition to our ability to get along with the collective. So it's both internal and external at the same time. And that's where I see virtue as being actually instrumental into having a civilized society. If you have people that are lying, cheating, and stealing, and not acting in just manners, then, or not acting in accordance with these principles, then you have chaos. And you have people that are just then that are no longer functional. So that's the way I see it.
Wonderful. Great thoughts. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Margarita, Brian, and Kevin. Margarita.
Yeah, there is this concept of virtues in action. It should not just be a perceived character that one's has. I mean, I see myself as brave. No, it's not. It won't be called virtue yet unless it performed into action. And I agree with Joe, it should be instrumental. So there's a goal that we need to obtain doing that. In positive psychology, in fact, we believe that if you're doing your virtues, that is the way to obtain mental health. There is this antithesis of diagnosing people with mental illness, but we also have this Bible now that supporting people to do virtue in order to obtain their mental health. So it's operational and instrumental. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Margarita. Next up is going to be Brian, followed by Douglas. Brian.
So I agree absolutely with what Joe said. A little bit of the background, Aristotle said this in his book on ethics. The study of ethics is the study of man in the city. And man is nature and nurture. And the goal is the harmonious city. It is very much is focusing on civic duty, which I think also others have stressed, but Joe also mentioned. The man is nature and nurture. He's stressing excellence in men. Just as he stressed, he's a biologist also, excellence in horses. He talked about excellence in horses. Then he talked about excellence in men. Men are weak, let's say, in their backs or with their legs compared to a horse, but they're strong with their rationality. They have little instinct, but they have a lot of reason. And so I think it's exactly as Joe said, if you're going to be an excellent man, you tune your instinct, you tune your reason. And how do you do that is through education. The Greek education, paideia, was really, and still is today, a very powerful influence in the world.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Next up is Douglas, followed by Katie, Kavita, and Kevin.
The question is morality. And three parts of that is, how do we become moral? How do we help other people become moral? And the third thing would be on morality, exactly what is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Douglas. Next up is going to be Katie, Kavita, Ambika, and Kevin. Katie.
Yeah, I think like the Tao Te Ching was good with the discussion of that virtue is largely an internal thing, or its focus is more on like internal virtues rather than like the perception of your virtues. And I think someone today was mentioning too, in a different place, he was talking about how it's hard to get away with lying too, which I agree with. Like if you do it, you can only do it some of the time. Otherwise, at some point, people will start to be able to catch on, and then they will like distrust your actions. So it's interesting to look at it both from internal and external.
Thank you, Katie. Next up is going to be Kavita and Ambika. Kavita.
Hi. Yeah. My perception of virtue is a very simplest version. I believe that virtue is the higher set of values one should pursue to have long-term gains instead of short-term gratifications. And I have I have listed out a few that I consider to be virtue that can be followed, which can be practiced. That is determination, truthfulness, honesty, charity, kindness, compassion, love. Living through the way of nature. So I think that these are some of the virtues that an individual can practice, and that's how we acquire it, and not just by acquiring knowledge, but just by practicing it in real life to live in accordance with nature. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kavita. Next up is going to be Ambika, Kevin, and Cheryl. Ambika.
So, lots of lovely things have been said, and I, of course, agree with what Joe said.
No, Ambika, you don't need to respond to everybody. You can just talk about what you got.
Okay, I was just getting there as a way to lead in.
Sure.
I wondered if all these qualities cohere in integrity, and when we lose integrity, we lose some of the virtues, all the other different qualities. And the same qualities that we need in our day-to-day life and social work, etc., are also similar, or maybe sometimes the same as in warfare on the battlefield. Going back again to keenness, sight, compatibility, and honesty and integrity. That's all I wanted to say for now.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Cheryl. Kevin.
Yeah, before what is virtue, I would say previous question, what's the good for community or for yourself? I'm going to use a quote from Edmund Wilson. No two persons ever read the same book. Especially these days, everyone can so connected, however, got their own book to read. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Cheryl.
I guess when I'm thinking about like what is virtue and how is it acquired, I think of like virtue as it relates to vice and us being born essentially good and essentially, but we have the capacity for evil. So we need temperance because we have the capability to indulge, and we're born with natural fear. So we need to develop courage in some areas. And just like we're born with a natural justice, but we also need to learn the laws and how to relate to others in society. So I do think that there's an element to it that has to be taught and learned because we have the propensity for evil, even though we're essentially good.
Thank you, Cheryl. Dave, what is virtue and how is it acquired?
Shrikant, I want to get into how do we teach virtue?
That's not the question, right? So let's put that. I'll put that as a question. How do you teach virtue?
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Judy.
I just wanted to say how I was taught virtue. And my grandmother said that she always said that virtue was a grace. And she used the word grace to signify something that made you feel good and that gave you a smile to your face. And she, like, for example, kindness and patience. She's always talked about patience being a virtue and that virtue was a grace. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Judy. Next up is going to be Brian. Brian, go ahead. Brian or Penny?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I've been dealing with taking care of my grandchildren for the last 7 years. And I think that a lot of virtue is basically taught and by example and by suggestion. Because with children, they're inclined they want their own thing all the time. And so you have to kind of suggest to them, like if a friend comes over, you know, try to share your toys and stuff like that. And so I think a lot of it is nurturing, and that in society and in the family, you have to kind of say the way people would like to be treated and the way you should act until they begin to accept that themselves and realize it.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question is going to be about the cardinal virtues and whether virtue is one or many. So the question is virtue one or many? And what are, if it is many, what are they and how are they related to one another? If you'd like to talk about that, is it one or many? And if it is many, how are they related to one another? Joe.
So there are many, but they are interrelated to one another. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, well, if we were to say which is the chief virtue, which is the one that is the most important, some would argue that it would be wisdom. Because without knowing what wise action, what is right or wrong, what the right thing to do is, then it really doesn't matter what action you're taking. And that's where kind of it's dependent on courage or knowing the just thing to do. How do you know? You have to have an idea what that is. Justice is the goal of restoring some kind of balance, right? How are you going to know what that balance is if you're not wise? However, I think there's another aspect to this too. I've seen arguments where people argue that temperance is the chief virtue, where it's what essentially makes us human. Our ability to withhold and not necessarily indulge ourselves, to sacrifice something, to bargain with the future, is our ability to actually say, I'm not going to do this now. I'm temperance. I'm actually, so you're using something that is actually a uniquely human attribute, and that this gears all the other virtues. You know, I'm going to be just, but I'm going to be temperance in my justice. So there's a relationship between those as well. So there's a lot of debate on how these all work. Justice, as far as Marcus Aurelius was concerned, was chief among them, because if you were unjust, then it just couldn't do a number of other things. Like you couldn't be, as I mentioned earlier, charitable. You can't steal from somebody and then give something back to them and call that charity. No, that would be, you need justice. It's the importance of justice in order to be able to be charitable. So it enables a lot of others. I think the cardinal virtues capture most of what we're talking about when we're talking about wise action. However, which they're interrelated. They're absolutely interrelated. And I don't see them as something that can be separated as a part. That's just my personal belief. I mean, there are arguments to the contrary, but that's where I'll leave my comments.
Wonderful. Joe, you're going to have a ball with this entire series. I know that you've thought a lot about.
This is my favorite series.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you've thought a lot about this topic, and I really look forward to your participation in this. Next up is going to be Margarita, Brian, and Cheryl. Margarita.
Yes, there research about this. So it seems that a person who can do one kind of virtue tend to also do the other virtue, certain virtue that's kind of interrelated, just like Joe said, and we measure it and we found out this interrelated virtues, they can be integrated into one concept, one bigger virtue or cardinal virtue. And I think what's interesting also, cardinal virtue tend to be something that is acknowledged in many cultures. So there's some kind of universality of this cardinal virtue compared to the specific localized virtue. So I think it's quite interesting how virtue can be universal to some extent. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Brian, Cheryl, and Kevin. Brian.
So the question is, are the virtues one or many? And I think that they are one insofar as they result in a single action. These things flow together into some action, some speech, maybe refraining from doing something. I also think that they're one in that they can, insofar as they can be subjected to the same types of criteria. Three of the criteria, or the action can be subject to the same criteria. Number one, have we avoided excess? Number two, is this a sustainable action over time? And number three, was one I call humility. What if I'm wrong? Which is kind of a risk analysis. What if I'm wrong? The last one I would add is the willingness to communicate and compromise with others in determining this action. In other words, melding their virtues with yours.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Cheryl, Jeff, and Kevin. Cheryl.
It's ironic that I'm following him because I've been studying Musar, which is a study of ancient I guess they're ancient Hebrew virtues, and there's 52. But the foundational virtue in Musar is humility. And if I was going to argue that there was one virtue, I would pick humility, but not the way it was just described as in, what if I'm wrong? The way it's described in Musar is no more than my place, no less than my space. And it pretty much covers the four cardinal virtues: no more courage, no more justice, no more temperance, and no more wisdom than taking up more space, as in arrogance, and as in having your respectable place in relation to others.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cheryl. Jeff, what do you think? Is virtue one or many?
So, I think it maybe has many aspects, but I think there's a possibility that it is one. And I'm a little bit surprised at what I'm about to say, because I know less about the Gita than anybody in this meetup, and maybe less than anybody I know. I'm very impressed with the belief that there's a divine spark within each of us, and that namaste is the divine light in me bows to the divine light in you. I'm very impressed with that. I think because that places me in relation to God, and it certainly influences my feelings and intuition, and it orients my thinking, and it orients my actions in relation to me and in relation to you. And that's a lot. That's a lot for one sentence to be able to communicate. So I'm very impressed with namaste.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. That's a fantastic observation. And the corollary of that is that it's like you're saying that the God within me is God. So there is God within each of us. And it's just that most people forget that. And most people are getting distracted by whatever else is going on. But there is a God in you and there is God in the other person. And you're absolutely right, because what it does is that if you get that right, then you have a basis to resolve everything else, because you have that deepest commonality between. So wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Joe. Kevin.
Yeah, one or two could be, I can select either one. One is, you talk about virtue, it's a kind of relationship between yourself or inner yourself between component different aspect. For example, your feeling to your intellectual, and also mainly a focus related to yourself with others. Just if one, you can measurable sacrifice for others. You can sacrifice for your own. That's one of you consider virtue. Another side is sacrifice for others from Jesus, for example, right? It's how close that area define your humanity or virtue. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is going to be Joe.
I was just basically going to make a brief comment because I found Cheryl's exploration into the idea of humility as this virtue to be very interesting. It sounded very much like the Aristotelian mean, in a way, that you weren't going to take too much or too little of something, so that you're kind of hitting the golden mean between, you're not going to an extreme whenever you're actually trying to demonstrate some degree of virtue. So humility on one end could be seen as an extreme because pride would be on the other. So you would want something in between. It's just a thought experiment more than anything. I'm just commenting on something that she had said because it's interesting.
Thank you, Joe. Next question is going to be, what is the good of virtue? Why be virtuous? Why be virtuous? That's the question. If you'd like to answer, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. What does virtue do for you? Let's start with Ambika, Evanik, and Joe. Ambika.
To appreciate the beauty of life, to focus on beauty, because beauty is a path to peace and harmony, to appreciate relationships, to appreciate life, liberty and happiness and each other, and build communion. And through the communion, you appreciate spirit continually. So for all of these reasons.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Evanik, Dave, and Joe. Evanik.
Yeah, I think it's the reason why it's good to be virtuous, because it's good for everyone. It's good for the individual. When Jeff was talking about namaste, which is recognizing the God in the other person and the God in you. If you recognize that, then it's harder to treat someone unjustly. So I think if your virtue is something like namaste, it's good for you, the individual and the community.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Dave and Jyoti. Dave.
Yeah, Shrikant, I believe we want everyone to be virtuous so we can live in a civilized society.
Thank you. Next up is Jyoti and Joe. Jyoti.
Yeah, virtuous life gives you a rich quality of life, and it makes you feel fulfilled. And you just feel like you are living a life of truth and honesty if you have virtuous life. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Joe, Cheryl, Brian, Kevin, and Ambika. Joe.
It provides your life with meaning. It gives it meaning. It provides you with meaningful interactions with other people, and it's its own reward. Marcus Aurelius was absolutely correct. Virtue is its own reward, so that you end up actually content and tranquil if you're in pursuit of virtue versus pursuing things that are materialistic and only to your own personal ends. And it actually provides a better place for the rest of the world, and it makes it functional. Without some of these things like trust, justice, we would not be functional. So it's for both ourselves internally and externally.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Cheryl, followed by Brian. Cheryl.
I would say two things, peace and harmony. Peaceful society and harmony of the soul. Inner peace.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Brian, Margarita, Katie, Kevin, and Ambika. Brian.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in addition to what other people were saying, to me, perhaps we should also look at virtue is not only for the good of society and for ourselves, but also for the good of the world, for the good of nature, that we should be taking care of the world, the material world too, and that would be virtuous.
Wonderful. Next up is Margarita, followed by Katie. Margarita.
I think evolutionary, this virtue that lost in certain community, it certain function to sustain us. And to some extent, virtue that are used in certain society, it's already selected because it support us to sustain the generation from generation. I think it's quite interesting why we need to instill virtue in our community starting from young age, because it seems like it is something unnatural actually that you need to learn, teach people to do that. So yeah, this is just another idea. I know that can be natural, can be virtuous, but to some extent, it's also you're obliged to follow virtue sometimes. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Katie, Kevin, and Ambika. Katie.
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to the idea of the 1/3 rule, that there's some point where if you do enough distrustful things that people will pull away, and you'll be harming yourself as well.
Thank you. Next up is Kevin, followed by Ambika. Kevin.
Oh, for me, it's one thing is to treat others the way you want to be treated. It's at least don't harm others. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambika, why virtue? Why be virtuous?
So following from what I said earlier, what I feel is the practicing of virtuous qualities develops in you self-management. And self-management is necessary for external actions, but also relationship with yourself, which means also that you are keeping healthy within, because how you think, how you act, what you say, and you know, how you react also affects your internal health. So self-management, virtuous self-management is also well-beingness of oneself and therefore of everybody else.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Judy, followed by Mike. Judy.
Okay, so why be virtuous? And I ask another question, why not? Why not be virtuous? It makes you feel good. It just, what other options do you have? It incarnates civility. It makes, it gets the better angels of yourself out there. And it gives you warm feelings. It just creates a lot of good things. So why not be virtue?
Wonderful. Mike, why be virtuous?
There's a different virtue definition depending on what your objectives are. If you're trying to maximize civilization, that's one thing. If you're trying to maximize ecology, that's another thing. If you're trying to maximize technology, that's another definition. And so one, again, needs to find the meaning of life, the purpose of life, the universe, and everything, and then decide what box you're going to integrate on, you're going to maximize on, and what your constraints are to define who is virtuous and why. And then you can adjust each individual so that you achieve that result.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. All right. Now it's time for everybody's questions. So folks, hope you've had time to think about questions that you would like to put on the table. So just questions at this point, just any additional questions, any questions that you want to, even if you have said a question before, you can go ahead and repeat it at this stage in order to emphasize that you really want, but waiting too long. Okay. All right. Questions. So Kevin, what's your question?
What's your top 3 virtues you value the most?
Okay, top 3 virtues. I really like that. We'll definitely take that one. Mike, what's your question?
To add that extra column, how do you add that extra column that says what is the purpose of all this, so that then you can determine how to optimize to meet that objective?
Okay, what are you trying to optimize? Okay. Next up, so folks, go ahead and ask, put any questions you would like on the table. Next up is Margarita.
Yeah, I wonder, what is the relationship between virtue and morality? It seems that we think that there is isomorphism, so they're the same, but I think it could be a dynamic relationship between them. It can be different. Thanks.
Okay, morality and virtue. Joe, what's your question?
I'm gonna try and attempt to rephrase Mike's.
Okay.
So yeah, how do you determine which virtues to aim at, like in order to optimize? So the cardinal virtues, and just an example, the cardinal virtues help me determine my aim. But
sure. So what are your top virtues? So what I'm going to do is, I think he meant what are your values with respect to which you're trying to optimize your virtues. So I'll keep both questions.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Next up is going to be Kiki. Kiki, what's your question? Kiki, you need to unmute yourself if you want to ask question. Okay, next up is going to be Ambika. Ambika, what's your question?
How do you know, or is there someone who is monitoring whether you have acquired those virtues? What is the test or judgment of knowing that you are participating with the virtues you have chosen to study?
Okay, how?
Don't know how else to.
Got it. Yeah. How do you evaluate your virtuousness? Next up is going to be Jyoti.
Are your virtues consistent, or they change according to the situation and according to the person you are dealing with, or with the community you are in?
Okay, do your virtues change with context? Next up is Jose. Jose Jacob, go ahead.
Hi, can everybody be virtuous, even the poor people?
Okay, can everybody be virtuous?
Even the poor people.
Next up is going to be David.
Yes, what are your motivations for your virtues?
Okay, what are the motivations?
Or your personal motivation.
Okay, personal motivations. Okay, these are fantastic questions. I just love them. So we'll go ahead and try to go through as many of them. Try to keep your answers just brief. The first one is going to be top 3 virtues. What are your top 3 virtues? Go ahead and type exclamation mark to talk about your top 3 virtues. Kavita, what are your top 3 virtues?
My top 3 virtues would be prudence, courage, and justice.
Prudence, courage, and justice. Excellent. Next up is going to be Jyoti, followed by Kiki. Jyoti.
Compassion, honesty, and hard work.
Compassion, honesty, and hard work. Okay, next up is going to be Kiki, followed by Joe and Mike. Kiki. Kiki, you need to unmute yourself. Okay, Kiki, if you can't unmute, go ahead and type it in the chat. Okay, next up is going to be Joe, followed by Mike.
Since I'm being forced to pick 3,
yes,
that's hard, but wisdom.
Everybody knew that you were thinking of 4 virtues. Everybody gave you only 3.
So, I mean, I'd have to say wisdom, justice, and courage, because courage, it's harder to take on something you fear versus temper something that you just don't like, or that you like to be, to reserve yourself.
Mike, 3 words. 3
taking
virtues.
a page from Ecclesiastes, wisdom followed by wisdom followed by wisdom.
All right, wisdom, wisdom, wisdom. Next up is going to be David. David, go ahead.
Trust, respect, and fairness.
Trust, respect, and fairness. Kiki puts humility, generosity, and wisdom. Cheryl.
Humility, prudence, and charity.
Prudence and charity. Kevin.
My answer, listening, empathy, honest.
What were the 3? I didn't get the first 2.
First, listening to others.
Listening.
Then, so empathy, then honesty.
Honesty. And what is the third one again?
Empathy.
Empathy. Okay. Thank you. Margarita.
Love of learning, humanity, and fairness.
Humanity and fairness. Very nice. Humanity, fairness. Oh, this is excellent, excellent list. Thank you. All right. Next up is, let's see here. Okay, let's take the tough. Oh, wait a minute. We have got Judy and Ada. Judy, you need to unmute.
Mine is care, responsibility, and acceptance.
Care, responsibility, and acceptance. Ada.
Yeah, in addition to what everyone has said, I don't want to repeat anything anyone has said. I just want to mention one that I haven't heard anyone say, and that is courage.
Okay, courage. Thank you. Ambika, 3 virtues. Ambika, you need to unmute.
Responsibility, generosity, and caring or kindness.
Caring and kindness, generosity. Okay, very good. Brian or Penny? I would like both to answer. I want to see if it's the same or different. Go ahead.
So wisdom, love, and courage.
Penny.
Well, I had come up with two: honesty, selflessness, and something like motivation, but I'm not quite sure how to put that in.
Got it. Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Next up, we'll take the question that Jyoti asked, which is a very interesting question. How do you evaluate your virtuousness? What's the feedback mechanism? How do you determine how virtuous you are? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Kevin.
I would say intention, one word is intention. What is intention to do? Benefit to yourself, your community, or others. Thank you.
Okay. Next up is Margarita.
This is interesting. I think it's more on self-retrospective. So you learn what you have done and how you feel about what you've done. It is not from the eyes from other person, professional or like expert, but it's about knowing yourself and what you have performed this time. Yeah, I think that's
wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Joe.
I think it's something that comes from both internal and external. So you're looking at yourself internally by journaling and maybe asking yourself these questions and challenging yourself whether you made the right decision in a particular situation, whether you acted in accordance with your value system. But it's also asking people who are wise that they can offer you an outside opinion whether or not you can, you had made a good decision. I always felt like that would be one of the greatest benefits of being married, is that you get that feedback, that you would, constantly be reminded of where you maybe went wrong. Although, but that could get old too.
Yes, I'm constantly reminded of where I went wrong.
Thank you, Brian. Kiki, are you able to unmute? Doesn't look like. Okay, next up is going to be Kavita, Mike, Evanik, and Katie. Kavita.
Yeah, mine is almost similar to what Joe said. It's both internal and external evaluation through self-reflection. And the external would be obtaining feedback and what the consequences of our actions will be our evaluation point. So, yeah.
Wonderful. I do think that the external feedback is very important because it's very easy to have a confirmation bias within yourself. So to have just, and also you have to, I like Ray Dalio's idea, is that you have to evaluate the evaluator too, to figure out whether whether somebody is trust, it's like you have a score of saying that, okay, this person on this one is good, has good judgment, and this person doesn't. So so next up is going to be Mike, Evanik, and Katie. Mike, how do you evaluate your virtuousness?
Well, this comes back to what is your objective, and maybe this is the place where you bring in it's in the social contract of what rather than optimize for the civil, for the purpose, for your own self, for your family, for your country, or whether you optimize at some other level. That so you bring in both wisdom and the social contract, as Hobbes described it, in order to create domestic tranquility, or whatever might be the objective that we wisely decide is what we ought to be doing.
Thank you. Next up is Evanik, followed by Katie, Dave, and Cheryl. Evanik.
I think it's how it lands over there with the other person. So if you're doing something in an action, it's how does it affect other people? And if it affects them negatively, could have been helped. Because sometimes you just can't help it. You got to do what you got to do, right? And can it be helped? And if it can, then definitely do that. But if it can't, then try to mitigate the negativity the best way possible.
Thank you, Evanique. Next up is Katie, followed by Dave. Katie.
Going along with my argument that people pull away when you've done something, and you can watch them, you can observe, are they pulling away just from you, or have they pulled away from a lot of people? So you're kind of evaluating the evaluator. And then my second thing is, I remember once you said that too, Shrikant, which is like multiple sources of the feedback, the more like broad, like you're getting the same feedback from different people, the more likely it is that that feedback is probably honest. It's like when I worked in customer service, they would, or a temp job, and that was had customer service responsibilities. They said, if it's just one person, we can probably ignore the feedback. And the more people you get, and the more broad the types of people giving the same feedback, the more likely they're going to say, like, this is something you need to work on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Katie. Next up is Dave, Cheryl, Ambika, and Brian. Dave.
How well you sleep at night.
Thank you. Next up is Cheryl.
I can't argue with peace of mind. That was great. I was just thinking that it's a lot of it is about when something happens, slowing down the response time, and thinking about your response, if you can put that pause in there, or if you can do visualization of a situation that you know you're going to have trouble with, and journaling about the way a situation went. And then mindfulness. I think we're underestimating the effectiveness of mindfulness and training ourselves to slow down.
Okay, Ambika, followed by either Brian or Penny, whoever is better at giving evaluative feedback. Ambika.
So when you feel out of alignment with yourself after having done or said something and you wonder, what did I do? How could I have done it? That's when you know you stepped away from it, or you're reacting to somebody's reaction to it, you know. Sometimes even that comes into play. So, and it doesn't feel good. It's like, damn, what did I do? You know, and that's when, you know, the previous thing about hatred comes in, to not dislike what you did, to forgive yourself, because somebody's got to do that. So thank you.
Next up is going to be Brian. Brian, go ahead.
So Penny's great on evaluative feedback, and I'm always grateful for it, but I do have my own comment on evaluative feedback. It's good to get the feedback before you take the action. So I'm very much into collaboration and discussing, agreeing before you take action as much as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Next up is going to be the question. Let me see. You know, there is a question that we have kind of danced around, and the one that Mike keeps asking. It's about really values. Let's first go to Judy. Judy, go ahead. How do you evaluate your virtuousness?
I'm sorry, I did it the last time. Anyway, take a chance, learn new things. Don't get stuck with yourself and what you know, and realize that your strengths can become your weaknesses.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Now, this is a question that Mike was bringing up. There's also a question about, you know, what exactly is, you know, how is virtue evaluated in relationship to value? You know, do you look at virtue in relationship to values, or virtue by itself? How does it work? What is the relationship between values and virtues? Is there anything else in morality that we have to look at other than virtues? And if so, what? I mean, there are other, in the most prominent candidate is values. So any thoughts about the place of virtues in morality, and any thoughts about relationship of virtues and values? Joe, followed by Evanik. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it as having a value system that you have, and then you have these principles that are essentially these guiding principles that you're aiming at, that allow you to live your life. So you ask yourself, what is your goal? To live a life of what? You know, what do you want out of life? What is your grand goal out of life? And once you kind of figured out what that is, and you realize it, whether it be for people, your interactions with others, you know, how you live in the world, how you impacted other people's lives, then that's your goal. And then you look at the values, that what is the best way to do that. And then you have these principles, and that's where the cardinal virtues for me come into play. And then you have these other virtues, and they're your aim. Am I acting justly? Am I acting wisely in this particular situation? So they guide your actions from there. So I think you have your goal, your values, and then your principles that you're going to manage yourself by.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Evanik, Margarita, and Jyoti. Evanik.
I think your values are kind of like your foundation. Your values are what you want for your life and how you want to live your life. And I think the guide is your virtues. It's like, that's how you get there. And then I think the actions is how you achieve your values. So, and I think the last point is evaluate. I think you evaluate by using the virtues. Like, was I virtuous in this action? Did it achieve what I value for myself in my life? And you go from there.
Thank you, Evanik. Next up is Margarita, Jyoti, and Ambika. Margarita.
To me, virtues are like good quality characters that's quite universal. But there are some virtue that will be stronger within a person. So that's like our value, the core of ourselves. Out of 100 virtues, perhaps, there are like 5 basic values that we're going to keep, because that kind of help us to endure and to sustain our life all this time. However, we still need to interact with the morality, which is very contextualized. I once surveyed inmates in prison in Indonesia, and I realized they also develop certain value, which probably is a conditioned response toward what happened in their living surrounding the environment. So I believe all of us have values or so-called virtues that we choose, which is contextualized. However, there are times that when our core values or virtues not align with the expected morality. So for example, when we're living in a patriarchal society and you're a woman, you're expected to have more caring, for example, not courageous. So yeah, that's quite unique when we understand and how to align our personal core values or virtues with the morality of our environment. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Margarita. Next up is Jyoti, Ambika, and Cheryl. Jyoti.
Okay, the way I look at it is, virtuous person usually has good values. They go hand in hand. Morality, on the other hand, can differ. Like in Gita, Mahabharata, Arjuna was a highly moralistic person, and he thought Krishna was making him do a moralistic thing by killing the others. So you have to look at the situation in a way that fits for everybody, not just for you, and that is moralistic. However, a virtuous person can differ in situation, in a moralistic situation. So having said that, I would say values and virtues go hand in hand, but not necessarily in a moralistic situation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is Ambika, followed by Cheryl. Ambika, what do you think is the relationship between values and virtues?
I thought we were talking about how to express your virtues.
If you want, you can talk about that. That's fine. But we were talking about the other one. But go ahead.
So when you see yourself as practicing or having certain, sometimes they can go back and forth. That, you know, your value is to love, your virtue is to love, and how you act on it. But I wonder when these become part of your nature, then it's a natural expression of those through actions. And I wonder if overthinking it can actually stunt it. It make you judge yourself to the point where you lose that naturalness of expression, and you don't have that because that spontaneity must be there. If you're always measured, then it might even be something that cannot be trusted, because you could be manipulating it into action for a moment, you know. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Thank you, Ambika. Next up is Cheryl, followed by Jose. Cheryl.
I guess I'm thinking along the same lines, because I tend to think of the values as the outcomes and the goals that Joe was talking about, that you act with virtue to derive a certain value. Like the value is happiness or peace or harmony, but you act with virtues so you can realize justice. And I mean, so you act with justice so there will be peace, or you act with courage so there will be justice. So I guess I was thinking of it in terms of that, like action and result.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Jose, Brian, Margarita, and David. Jose.
Yeah, on the subject of virtues and values, what I had heard or seem to have heard is that your values are kind of fixed. And we need to remember, at least from an Aristotelian point of view, that a virtuous act is preceded by deliberation. And that process of deliberation is called practical wisdom in the concept of Aristotle. Therefore, part of that practical wisdom is to revisit, to review your values, because some of your values may not be valuable. For example, if I have a moral foundation or a value that says I prefer money than to friends, meaning when in conflict between friendship and money, I will take money, well, maybe it's time to revisit that value, and otherwise you won't be able to act virtuously. So that's the relationship I see, is a bidirectional.
Excellent.
It goes both ways.
Thank you, Jose. Appreciate that. Next up is Brian, Margarita, and David. Brian.
Wow, I also liked what Jose said. I chimed in before he commented. What I would say, and it goes back kind of what Cheryl says, and I think what you referenced initially, I believe Mike's question, values and goals. Yes, I think that the virtues that are most important depend on the goals or values, just as Jose just outlined. But also in line with what Jose said, I think wisdom is very important virtue for the purpose of discerning the best goal or the highest value. And not only that, if that's not hard enough, the best goal and the highest value, typically there's a hierarchy, or there's more than one very good goal, and you don't want to abandon them all. There's good, better, best goals. And so balance and harmony is also part of the challenge here in terms of wisdom.
Thank you, Brian. Next up is Margarita, followed by David. Margarita.
Yeah, I agree with what Dave mentioned and Jose. It should be something, virtue should come from enlightened self. So you need to inspect, retrospect yourself from whatever happened. Otherwise, it will be bogus, like not real virtue. I've seen that, how virtuous behavior actually is so unnatural. It is made up. You need to be spiritual in this society. So you act like you're spiritual because that is valuable. That is morality, what is being correct, what is called correcting in one society. But sometimes when we choose to be true to ourselves, yeah, you can be a bit alien. Thanks.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be David Edelson. David.
Yes, I mean, the purpose of virtues to me comes back to the comments from Jordan Peterson about being able to play the game amongst larger groups, larger groups of people over time. I mean, so that you are virtuous, that the purpose of this is to be able to have a functioning society, a functioning culture. And if one isn't able to continue that, propagate that, then that's the underlying ethics, morality, and virtue that we're trying to achieve.
Wonderful. Let's take Dave's question next. How do you teach virtue? How do you teach virtue? Dave, what's your answer? You have a question and you have an answer. Go ahead.
I was trying to answer it before, but anyway, no, thank you very much, Shrikant. I think we teach by example. And so we hold up, this is the way you should behave. And we do that with stories. And I'll talk about my experience in the West. Obviously the Bible, but we don't really try to follow Jesus because he's perfect and we can't heal people and this, that, and the other. But the characters in the Old Testament are all more normally just ordinary people. Oh, and I need to add, well, when we start the story, we keep it simple. The first character we encounter is going to be the hero. We're going to follow that person's story. Now, usually it's going to be a man, but now in these days, it can be a woman. But they start throughout their life and they run into a challenge. Something terrible's happened. They, walls overcome, whatever. The virtue is how they overcome that challenge, climb over that wall. And they may even fail. They may end up dying in the process. But the main thing is they behave virtuously. So we put these examples out. Then it was a story of you going west of the frontier. We call it a Western story, cowboys and Indians, pardon me. But then police in these big city, now we're going to outer space. But yeah, we teach virtue with stories. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Great point. Next up is David, Evanik, Joe, Jyoti, and Margarita. David, how do you teach virtue?
Well, Dave already said it. I was actually going to say stories. That's exactly that's the purpose of stories.
Excellent. Next up is Evanik.
Inspiration plus example. I think I agree with what both Dave said too. It's the stories, but the key thing is the stories have to inspire you. And then the examples have to inspire you.
Wonderful. Joe, Jyoti, Margarita, and Ambika. Joe.
So, I mean, I was also going to say by example and through stories, but what we
Dave caused a lot of problem to a lot of people,
Sure did. I mean, really, I mean,
beforehand.
He was quick with that trigger, and he really kind of put a bullet in everybody's thoughts. Yeah. No, but there is another way as well, is by looking at individuals that you don't want to be like. And that's an interest, they serve a purpose as well. So, the idea that somebody behaving without virtue and saying, that's an example of what I don't want to be. If somebody's lying, or actually if somebody's like, shall we say, defaming another person, that's not necessarily something you want to do. So they serve a purpose as well as those who ruin the reputations of others, do things like that. I think that then you understand, well, that's not exactly what I should be modeling. And then you do the opposite. So that's another way of learning.
Okay, let's go with Jeff next. So Jeff, Margarita, and Ambika. Jeff. Sorry, Jeff, followed by Jyoti. Jeff.
So just building quickly on the story premise. So I think that's very much true. I actually want to bring in, mental interiority as advanced by our friend Brian McVeigh, because the stories that we tell ourselves about the past, about what's going on in the present, and the way that we kind of tell the future, predict the future in the stories we tell as to where things are going and where we're going. We have many, many options in what we decide to include in those stories, what we give meaning to and focus, and what we decide is the moral to those stories. And so I think that the idea of reframing, if you will, our own stories, as in they say, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, that we become to some extent what we expect. And so do other people. People become what's the story that we tell ourselves about them. Our relationship becomes that. So I think that this idea of stories is right, but there's more than one possible story, and there's more than one possible moral, whether it's the past, the present, or the future. And that's very important in many, many ways.
Thank you, Jeff. Jyoti, how do you teach virtue?
Well, virtues are taught by modeling. You see your parents, you see your significant others, and they set up a good example for you. And then as a child, when you are read stories of different characters which have good virtues, that helps you, and they're repeated. Those stories are repeated constantly, and you get that feeling. Now, I'm going to tell you something which might become contradictory, but listen to this. I think we also have a DNA for good virtues. So sometimes they are not taught. You just come with them. You're just a moralistic person. You're an honest person, hardworking person, and you are not really in a family where you see that behavior, but some of the children have it. And that's where it is coming from, nature, nurture. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is Margarita, followed by Ambika and Brian. Margarita.
I agree that stories, example, bad example are the basic approach for cognition, moral cognition. So you know about what is right or wrong. But because virtues is in action, so perhaps we also facilitate performance. So to some extent, I think we need to provide conflicts or problem or dilemma for people to learn how to put into practice what they learn about this good or right or virtue. It's not just self-inflated idea about oneself that you label yourself as courteous or brave, but when you deal with dilemma, that is the real task. So yeah, that's my idea.
Wonderful, thank you. Ambika, how do you teach virtue?
Guess what? Stories, of course. But also there's so many different ways to use stories, and I love what Jeff said, but also have situations and do role play and have a discussion. How do you feel doing this? And how do you feel about this? You did this to this person in this story. How did you feel about it? So you actually begin to experience the wellness or the not wellness of a certain action, and then you can have a conversation. Those conversations must not be judgmental, because that's where somebody's going to get stuck. In a family, there are different kids, and one child is praised more, one child is scolded more. Right there, the problem begins, because then that action becomes, punishable and so on. So how we respond to the children and the young and ourselves. Often, we hear parents speaking of how teaching their children to be moralistic, but then when the son is a CEO doing evil things, I'm so proud of my son, he's now a CEO. So that hypocrisy somehow starts to come up. So we need to track these levels of relationships as we, get into different situations, but it's such a dance. And when does a virtue become a vice?
Thank you. Next up is Brian, followed by Cheryl and Kevin. Brian.
Well, I want to learn from Jeff Nugent at this point and flag up, just having watched him and some of the things he said in the sessions he's led. You can teach virtue also by asking questions. I've seen that. Well, I've seen Penny do that with the children. I sometimes do it. I know Jeff does that in his consulting and coaching. It could really lead to invite persons into that interiority that he was talking about. And then the complement to that then is being there for other people. And that's something that's beyond outside of school, where you have teachers that hopefully can ask questions. You also get out into the kind of the real world, the practical world, where you have to take actions where the virtues are really applied. There, I think it's useful to have mentoring and coaching. Again, along the lines that I know Jeff practices. So it's not just the learning and hearing the stories, it's practicing. And as you're starting out, you do it through, hopefully you can do it in some type of apprenticeship. And then as you become a master, you learn not just to learn from your own master, but you learn to collaborate with others. And in that way, you continue to get this feedback and to develop your virtues.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Cheryl, Judy, and Kevin. Cheryl.
I was just going to give the example along the lines of what Jeff was talking about, is that history, the historical outcomes over time. You can't just look at one story, but you have to look at how that story plays out time and again. I wanted to mention art, because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words sometimes. And the last thing I wanted to mention was personal experience. We all remember that feeling the first time you went head first off a diving board and you learned courage, or the first time you overate, or any mistake that you make. Failure is a great teacher. We all learn our lessons that way, or from overeating and getting a stomach ache and learning temperance. I think it's a lot of experience in our lives that we teach ourselves.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Kevin, followed by Judy. Kevin.
Thank you. I would expand one point from Joe's. I guess he mentioned we need to revisit our value about virtue self. Over time, there could be change. That's point one. Second is I would say this stage, one kid or less, or two kids, it's different, 50, 100 years ago. For me, I have to try make conversational with them, make friends, listen each other, learn each other. For example, I learned from my kids. They learn from school for green. They try to separate this, that, tell me, learn from school. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Judy.
Hi, two things. One is that it's not how you teach virtue, it's how do you learn virtue about virtues. In adult education, there is a theory saying that first you do theory, and then you do examples, or applications, or vice versa. You start with applications, and then you go into the theory. But what makes a person or a student at whatever age motivated to learn? That's the key question.
Wonderful, folks. So this was fantastic. I enjoyed it. So please let me know how it worked. I'm going to do this as a series on 103 Great Ideas. I will take different virtues. The next ones are going to be courage. I'm going to do the 4 virtues: courage, prudence, justice, and temperance next. So please go ahead and type ! if you would like to give me comments on how this thing went, the entire presentation. There are actually two parts. One is summarizing everything, then 103 great ideas, then doing the addition using the diagram and Bible, Tao Te Ching, and Bhagavad Gita. And the third one was on questions, the Q&A that we did. So give me feedback on each of those things if you would like, or any one of them, or none of them, whatever you prefer. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to give me feedback. Joe, what did you think?
I thought it was really, this is wonderful. This is right up my alley. So I think this is going to allow us to make connections between the three great works. So it's going to be done in unison with them. We'll start to see where these virtues actually are meaningful within those three works. So that's huge. I also like the fact that you'll be covering them individually. I would also maybe even expand it to include at some point the theological virtues as well.
They don't have theological virtues in 52 ideas.
Okay. So
I'm planning to expand it into kind of related ideas like beauty, for example, something like that, which has like moral connotations to it. So I will look at, basically, I'm just focusing on things which are crucial to leading a human life. Kind of anything to do with kind of morality, any kind of flavor of it. So I'll start with these four and then probably add at least a few more after that.
I think that's a fantastic approach to take. So I'm very much looking forward to this series.
I'm glad. Next up is Kevin, followed by Ambika. Kevin, what did you think?
Yeah, it's great overall. One suggestion for your awesome diagram is the tabular chart. It's you on the bottom like a summary. If you add one column, add another summary, compare each row. That's also have some inspiration over there. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Ambika, what did you think?
I think it was a great start. It was good fun. I think fun is important, especially when you're studying virtue.
Thank you. Next up is Jeff. What did you think?
I think it's a terrific start, and I really did love that you so thoroughly integrated questions underneath each of the conclusions and the virtues, because I think that everything from the diagram to the virtues themselves to our exploring them, they are answers to questions. And it's a little bit like prompts in writing. It really does enrich the conversation to be explicit about the questions underneath to which those virtues or principles are an answer. And I think it's a very powerful way to do it. And I appreciate and enjoyed you doing that this evening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Judy, what did you think?
I think that you made us think, and you made us explore, and made us connect, and beyond our expectations. At least for me, I can speak for myself. I mean, I started connecting things like archetypes and tarot and all kinds of things. So it's just like an exploration, a trip to outer space, you know. So I felt really good about the whole thing, and I want to continue with the other virtues. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Next up is Cheryl, followed by Evanique. Cheryl.
At the beginning, you said this was challenging, Shrikant, but you really did a great job. And I think Socrates would be proud of your method tonight of posing those questions and getting us going in that direction. That was just great.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cheryl. Next up is Evanique. Evanique, what did you think?
I think it was great. I think it was easy for someone like me who's like, this is my first time really diving deep into this topic of virtues and the reading. So I think I'm looking forward to the other meetups, and I think it was great, and it was easy to jump in and participate. So thanks.
Excellent. See, that's the beauty of this 103 Great Ideas. Even if you have not worked on it explicitly, even if you have not read any of this thing explicitly, if you are a good person, if you're a thinking person, if you're a moral person, you actually have thought about these things in your own way. And the questions are the questions that have been asked at that level, which are appropriate for human beings. So anybody who is a thoughtful person, like yourself, gets a lot of value from it, even if you have not read anything. So that's the beauty of it. Thank you. Next up is Kavita, followed by Brian. Kavita.
Yeah, this was a very thoughtful, thought-provoking session. And like I missed some of the previous meetups, and I thought, like, when I looked at the tabular column, it just gave me a single word on each and how you reflected, and they were all connected to each other in a way, and how good it is to start a new year when we are all making our goals and these values and virtues, which makes us revisit why we are in the first place, like making those goals. So it gives a whole new purpose and meaning for our existence. So that was great, I think. And yeah, I just wish that I could get more out of this. It was amazing. Thank you.
Wonderful, Kavita. Thank you so much. That was great, great feedback. Thank you. Next up is Brian.
So if I might use Jordan Peterson's, excuse me, Jordan Peterson's paradigm, this is a perfect balance between order and chaos.
Yes.
Or to use Judy's one-word summary, a great trip.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Penny, what did you think?
Well, I thought it was very good, and I liked the question and answering. It led to a lot of thinking about different things, and the topic.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, I thought it was good.
Excellent. Margarita, what did you think?
I love it. Thank you so much, Srikanth, for facilitating this. I hope that we discuss virtues and we also learn how to put it into action. Virtues in action.
Excellent. On that note, Happy New Year, everybody. This is a great way of starting a new year with all these meetups, and we will see you soon. Good night, everybody.
Happy New Year, Srikanth. Thank you.
Bye. Happy New Year. Bye.
Happy New Year.